hear a bit more about Steve. I'm intrigued because I suppose I have a bit of a, I suppose, entrepreneurial man crush on Steve. And also the other interesting, useless information is that Steve Jobs' birthday is the 24th of February, which is the same as mine. So,
Oh my God, that's
yeah.
exciting.
So,
Yeah,
and
so you're,
yeah. So, and also I read one of his biographies written, which I carded as one of the hardcover books written by one of the top writers. And I think I dragged around Italy with me about 8 or 9 years ago. And
yeah.
so I sort of read a fair bit about Steve. So I'd love to hear more about
Sure.
and you mentioned that the public persona versus the private persona is quite different. And yeah, tell us some stories. I'm intrigued.
Sure. Yeah, I can't say that I have a lock on all of his stories, but from my perspective, some really interesting ones. Um, the first time I joined was just you know, you get the orientation, and you really get a sort of a initial sort of brain dump from Steve. And I'll never forget just being part of a group of maybe 3 or 4 people that got to sit down on the couch and just hear Steve pontificate and welcome us to the team and individually addressing us and asking us questions. That was just my initial real connection with Steve at that point, was an employee, and but I'll never forget. We worked in an office in a location near Xerox Park at the time in Palo Alto. It was an office on I think it was called Deer Creek, and this is before they moved to eventually to Seaport in Boulevard in Redwood City. I worked at an office of like 3 or 4 people on the graphics team, so it was a pretty crowded little startup. But next door in an office next to me was my friend Keith Ohlfs, who was the designer of the Next user interface. Mm-hmm. Just a brilliant designer, and a lot of his work has transitioned into the Mac and certainly into the iPhone since that time. But he's an amazing person. He was every day I would see Steve, trancing past our office door to meet with Keith, who was developing the interface for Next. And I would hear just constant yelling. Steve would constantly yell at Keith, calling him names and just things I can't repeat on air here. And it was uncomfortable to listen to. And so when Steve left, I went over to my friend's office to say, hey, first of all, why is he yelling at you? Why is he calling you names? And why are you putting up with this shit? So,
that's right.
And Keith is, he's probably fairly, well, anyway, he said, I just let it roll off my shoulder. He said, literally, Steve's passionate about the UI. I'm making it happen for him. So Steve really loves what I'm doing. I just let it go. He needs to get it out of his system. But it just happened again and again and again. And I just am amazed to this day that he could put up with that kind of, abuse, really. Keith is famous for the beach ball cursor on the Mac. So you'll see it, if you're waiting for something to happen. He invented that, among other things. He's just the kindest soul. And the really sad thing is Keith died a few years ago at 52. It's just really a shame. So many friends. He was an amazing guy, very creative. He created something called Pixel Site, which is a web-based animation editor. It was really amazing. So another story was once we moved to the new offices in Redwood City, we each had our own office with a beautiful view. It was just an incredible experience to have that opportunity as well. But in a new building, problems can occur. It was a 2-story engineering building, really beautifully outfitted. In fact, Steve was very proud of the fact that the building had these floating staircases. That was I think it was designed by some Italian architect. But one of the crazy things that happened early on was, for some reason, one day we found out that we couldn't go to the bathroom. The bathrooms were blocked. Mm-hmm. And we're like, what's going on here? We need to, take a pee. And we found out that Steve was in the bathroom yelling at the contractors who, because the tile color was wrong. So I'm like, okay, but it was like a different shade of gray, So, it was like very strange. Steve was very, very detail oriented, when it came to visual matters. And he basically closed down the men's bathroom for 2-3 weeks while the contractors refitted it. So we had to walk all the way into the other building when we had to go to the bathroom. So, another experience I had was he would take us to company retreats, and it was a special time. He took us one year to a location in Santa Cruz, at a place called Chaminade. It's a very nice, luxurious place to have a conference. And I'll never forget, though, this was back in the days when they had just released the Cube, and they're getting feedback because they were going to starting to work on the next product, which is the pizza box that they called it, the flat, color machine, which was the next stage, which I was, lucky to work on. But I remember everyone was sitting around on couches instead of, conference tables in a big auditorium. And it was a free for all. I mean, Steve was very humble, and he asked, questions, but people would literally insult him and throw tomatoes. And I mean, it was just a lot of fun. And Steve was just listening like, oh my God, what this drive does suck. What do we do about it? He was very interactive and very humble, I think, at the time, which is, I think, unusual. People say he's a dictator but he really listens to his staff. And I think one thing that really impressed me was that while he treated marketing folks with disdain, he really just, what's the right word? He adored engineers because engineers made it happen for him. And he was not an engineer. And I think it carried over from Steve Wozniak, who made it happen for Apple too. So he would bring people through the office, notable people like personalities. One day he brought Ross Perot into my office, Jeff, right. And it was
okay. Yep.
Pretty crazy. Who he was. He ran for president in '92.
Yep.
And he's a little bit of a kooky guy. He didn't win, but wealthy, very wealthy guy. He invested in Next. But Steve just pops in and brings Ross Perot. I'm just working there. And suddenly Ross Perot's in my office and says, hey, Ted, I'd like you to introduce Ross Perot. It was so surreal, Jeff. I mean, it was, and exciting. And he'd bring other people in too. I mean, he brought his wife in one day to meet the team. So I think her name was Lauren or something, and other people. So it was a fun experience.